How did a group of small, scattered, and deeply divided colonies manage to defeat the most powerful empire on earth? In the late 1700s, Great Britain ruled the seas, commanded a professional army, and controlled colonies across the globe. The American colonies, by contrast, had no navy to speak of, no unified government, little money, and no guarantee that their neighbors even agreed on the idea of rebellion. And yet, against all odds, these 13 colonies not only fought the British Empire, they won, and in doing so, created a brand new nation. Imagine the scene. Crowded streets filled with angry protests, merchants closing their shops in defiance, British redcoats marching through colonial towns, shots ringing out at Lexington and Concord, ink drying on a document that would change world history, the Declaration of Independence. These moments were not inevitable steps toward freedom. Each one was dangerous, uncertain, and could have ended in failure. At the time, no one knew the colonies would succeed. Many believed rebellion was madness. The power gap was enormous. Britain had wealth, experience, and the strongest military force in the world. The colonies had farmers, shopkeepers, and volunteers, many with no training and outdated weapons. Britain could replace soldiers and ships. The colonies could not. Britain fought to maintain an empire. The colonists fought with everything on the line: their lives, their property, and their future. On paper, this war should have ended quickly. History, however, had other plans. What makes the American Revolution so remarkable is that it was not just a war of muskets and cannons, it was a war of ideas. At the beginning, many colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects. They wanted fairness, not independence. But year by year, law by law, and crisis by crisis, frustration turned into resistance, and resistance turned into rebellion. Ordinary people began to ask extraordinary questions. Who should have power? What rights are people born with? When does a government lose its authority? Over time, the colonies transformed. They went from protesting taxes to challenging the very idea of monarchy. They went from asking for representation to declaring independence. They went from divided colonies to United States. Leaders emerged, alliances formed, sacrifices were made, and the impossible slowly became possible. In this video, you'll discover why the American Revolution began, how a group of underprepared colonies managed to defeat a global superpower, and what the victory truly changed, not just for America, but for the world. You'll see how battles were won, how ideas spread, and how a nation was born from uncertainty and risk. This is not just the story of a war. It is the story of how 13 colonies became the United States of America. Before the first shots of the American Revolution were ever fired, the 13 colonies were firmly tied to Great Britain. Established along the Atlantic coast of North America, these colonies existed under British rule for more than a century. The king's authority was recognized, British laws shaped trade and governance, and colonial governors were appointed by the crown. For a long time, this relationship worked. Britain offered protection, access to global trade, and a shared cultural identity, while the colonies provided raw materials and economic growth for the empire. Life in the colonies before the war was diverse and often demanding. Most people were farmers, artisans, merchants, or laborers. Towns bustled with trade, newspapers circulated ideas, and churches played a central role in community life. While the colonies shared language and traditions with Britain, they also developed their own identities. Distance from London allowed colonists a degree of self-rule through local assemblies, and many grew accustomed to making decisions without constant oversight from the crown. Over time, this independence in daily life fostered a growing belief that they should have a stronger voice in how they were governed. Tensions began to rise after Britain emerged deeply in debt following the French and Indian War. To recover financially and maintain control, Parliament imposed new taxes on the colonies, including the Stamp Act and later the Townshend and Tea Acts. Colonists were outraged, not simply because they were taxed, but because they had no representatives in Parliament. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," captured a growing belief that British policies violated their rights as English citizens. Trade restrictions, enforced by British troops, further deepened resentment. British control extended beyond money. Laws regulated what the colonies could produce and trade, limiting economic freedom. Soldiers were stationed in colonial cities, and colonists were sometimes required to house them. To many, these actions felt less like protection and more like occupation. Incidents such as the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party intensified mistrust and anger on both sides, pushing relations closer to the breaking point. Yet the American Revolution was not only about taxes or laws, it was a revolution of ideas. Enlightenment thinkers inspired colonists to question authority, natural rights, and the purpose of government itself. Ideas about liberty, equality, and consent of the governed spread through pamphlets, speeches, and town meetings. People began to believe that power should come from the people, not a distant king. As debates turned into protests, and protests into confrontation, compromise became harder to achieve. Each new law, each act of resistance, and each show of force pushed Britain and the colonies further apart. By the mid-1770s, conflict was no longer a question of if, but when. The road to revolution had been set, and the struggle for independence was about to begin. After the French and Indian War ended in 1763, the relationship between Great Britain and its American colonies began to change in ways few colonists could have predicted. Britain had won the war and gained vast new territories in North America, but victory came at a tremendous cost. The British government was deeply in debt and faced the expensive task of defending its expanded empire. British leaders believed the colonies should help pay for their own protection, especially since British troops were stationed in North America to prevent future conflicts. From London's perspective, taxing the colonies seemed reasonable. From the colonies' perspective, it felt like a sudden and unfair shift. For years, the colonies had enjoyed a period of relative independence. British oversight existed, but it was often loose and inconsistent. Colonists governed themselves through local assemblies, controlled their internal affairs, and paid mostly local taxes. This period of salutary neglect allowed the colonies to grow economically and politically confident. When Britain began enforcing laws more strictly and introducing new taxes, colonists felt their long-standing freedoms were being stripped away. The first major spark came with the Stamp Act of 1765. This law required colonists to purchase special stamped paper for legal documents, newspapers, licenses, and even playing cards. It directly affected a wide range of people, including lawyers, printers, merchants, and ordinary citizens. The reaction was swift and intense. Colonists argued that Parliament had no right to tax them because they had no representatives there. Protests erupted across the colonies. Stamp distributors were threatened or forced to resign, and merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Under heavy pressure, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but the damage was done. Colonists had learned that resistance could work. Soon after, Britain introduced the Townshend Acts, which placed taxes on imported goods such as glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. Once again, colonists responded with outrage. They viewed these taxes as another attempt to control colonial trade and raise revenue without consent. Boycotts spread, and colonial groups encouraged people to buy local goods instead of British imports. Women played a crucial role during this period, producing homemade cloth and organizing support for the boycott movement. Tensions rose further as British officials cracked down on smuggling and sent more troops to enforce the laws, particularly in Boston. The presence of British soldiers in colonial cities created daily friction. Soldiers competed with colonists for jobs, enforced unpopular laws, and symbolized British authority. This tension exploded in March 1770 during an incident that became known as the Boston Massacre. After a confrontation between colonists and British soldiers, shots were fired, killing 5 colonists. Although the event was chaotic and confusing, colonial leaders used it as powerful propaganda. Newspapers and pamphlets portrayed the soldiers as brutal oppressors, fueling anger and fear throughout the colonies. While Britain repealed most of the Townshend taxes soon after, it kept the tax on tea, a decision that would prove critical. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, designed to rescue the struggling British East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies at a lower price. Although the tea was cheaper, colonists saw the act as a dangerous trick. Buying the tea would mean accepting Parliament's right to tax them. In response, a group of colonists disguised as Native Americans boarded British ships in Boston Harbor and dumped hundreds of chests of tea into the water. This act of defiance, known as the Boston Tea Party, sent a clear message. Colonial resistance had reached a new level. Britain reacted harshly. In 1774, Parliament passed a series of laws known to the colonists as the Intolerable Acts. These laws punished Massachusetts by closing Boston Harbor, limiting self-government, and allowing British officials accused of crimes to be tried outside the colonies. Too many colonists, these measures proved that Britain was willing to use force to crush resistance. Sympathy for Massachusetts spread, and colonies that had once acted independently began to see the value of unity. Colonial leaders responded by organizing the First Continental Congress, where representatives from 12 colonies met to discuss a collective response. They agreed to continue boycotts, support Massachusetts, and prepare for possible conflict. At this point, most colonists still did not seek independence. They hoped Britain would change course. However, trust had eroded. Each tax, protest, and punishment pushed the two sides further apart. By the mid-1770s, tensions were no longer isolated incidents, but part of a growing crisis. British authority was increasingly challenged, and colonial resistance was becoming organized and determined. The cycle of action and reaction made compromise less likely with each passing year. What began as disagreements over taxes and laws had grown into a struggle over rights, power, and control. The road to war was being paved, and the colonies were moving steadily toward a conflict that would change history forever. By the spring of 1775, the tension between Great Britain and the American colonies had reached a breaking point. Years of protests, boycotts, and political arguments had failed to bring real compromise. British officials increasingly viewed colonial resistance as rebellion, while colonists believed their rights were under direct attack. Both sides began preparing for the possibility of armed conflict, and in Massachusetts, the situation grew especially dangerous. British troops were stationed in Boston, while colonial militias known as Minutemen quietly gathered weapons and trained in nearby towns. The spark that ignited the war came on April 19, 1775, in the small towns of Lexington and Concord. British General Thomas Gage ordered troops to march from Boston to Concord to seize colonial military supplies and arrest key Patriot leaders. Word of the mission spread quickly, and colonial riders warned nearby towns. At dawn in Lexington, British soldiers encountered a group of colonial militia. Tensions were high, and no one knows who fired the first shot, but gunfire erupted. Several colonists were killed, and the British continued on toward Concord. Their colonial forces met them again at the North Bridge, forcing the British to retreat. As the Redcoats marched back to Boston, colonial militias attacked from behind trees, stone walls, and houses. By the end of the day, the British suffered heavy casualties. What began as a mission to seize supplies had turned into open war. News of the fighting spread rapidly throughout the colonies. Volunteers rushed to Boston, surrounding the city and trapping British troops inside. This gathering of colonial fighters marked the beginning of a larger, organized resistance. Though still unofficial, the colonies were now at war with Britain. The fighting at Lexington and Concord shattered any remaining hope that the conflict could be resolved peacefully. Blood had been spilled, and the path forward was clear. In May 1775, colonial leaders met at the Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Faced with the reality of war, they took a historic step by creating the Continental Army to unite colonial forces under one command. This decision transformed scattered militias into a national fighting force, at least in theory. The Congress also appointed George Washington, a respected Virginia planter and experienced military officer, as commander-in-chief. Washington's selection was strategic. His leadership helped unite colonies from the North and South and gave the army a sense of legitimacy and discipline. George Washington faced enormous challenges from the start. The men under his command came from different colonies, spoke with different accents, followed different rules, and often enlisted for short terms. Many lacked proper weapons, uniforms, and training. Some carried old muskets, while others brought farming tools, or nothing at all. Food and supplies were scarce, and disease spread quickly through crowded camps. Washington understood that building a disciplined army would take time, patience, and strong leadership. Despite these difficulties, Washington brought stability and purpose to the Continental Army. He emphasized order, training, and perseverance, even when victories were rare. He understood that the colonies did not need to defeat Britain in every battle, they simply needed to survive long enough to keep the cause alive. This strategic mindset would become one of his greatest strengths. The early months of the war revealed just how unprepared the colonies were. British forces were well-trained professionals, with experience fighting in Europe and across the empire. They had better equipment, stronger supply lines, and the support of the world's most powerful navy. In contrast, colonial soldiers were often unpaid, poorly fed, and uncertain about the future. Many questioned whether independence was worth the sacrifice, especially since most still claimed loyalty to the king. One of the first major confrontations after Lexington and Concord was the Battle of Bunker Hill in June 1775. Although the British technically won the battle, they suffered heavy losses. The engagement proved that colonial forces could stand up to British regulars, boosting patriot confidence. At the same time, it revealed the high cost of war and the urgent need for supplies and training. As fighting spread, it became clear that this was no longer a series of protests or isolated skirmishes. The colonies were engaged in a full-scale war against one of the strongest empires in the world. Washington and his army faced constant shortages, desertion, and uncertainty. Yet, the very act of standing up to Britain united many colonists around a shared cause. By the end of 1775, the American Revolution had moved beyond political debate and into armed struggle. The formation of the Continental Army, the leadership of George Washington, and the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord marked a turning point. The colonies had crossed the line from resistance to rebellion. Though the road ahead would be long and filled with hardship, the war for independence had begun, and there was no turning back. By 1776, the American colonies were already fighting Britain, but one crucial question remained unresolved. Were they fighting to fix their relationship with the British Empire, or to leave it entirely? Declaring independence was an enormous and dangerous step. Until this point, many colonists still hoped for reconciliation. They believed the king might intervene, remove unfair laws, and restore their rights. Declaring independence meant ending that possibility forever. It meant committing fully to rebellion, knowing that failure would bring severe punishment, loss of property, imprisonment, or execution for treason. For many colonists, independence was not an obvious or easy choice. It was a leap into the unknown. The risks were staggering. The colonies were militarily weak, economically dependent on trade, and politically divided. Britain, on the other hand, was the most powerful empire in the world, with a professional army and navy. If the colonies lost the war, after declaring independence, there would be no mercy. Leaders who signed an independence document were well aware they were placing their lives on the line. Even among patriot leaders, there were deep disagreements. Some feared independence would lead to chaos, foreign invasion, or internal collapse. Others worried ordinary people were not ready to abandon the monarchy they had known all their lives. What helped push public opinion toward independence was not a battle, but a pamphlet. In early 1776, Thomas Paine published Common Sense, a short but powerful work written in simple, direct language. Unlike political essays meant for elites, Common Sense spoke to ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, laborers. Paine attacked the idea of monarchy itself, arguing that it was unnatural, corrupt, and unjust. He questioned why a distant island should rule an entire continent, and insisted that independence was not only necessary, but inevitable. Paine's arguments were bold and persuasive. He reframed the conflict as a moral struggle, not just a political dispute. According to Paine, independence was the only way to secure liberty and build a society based on equality and self-government. The pamphlet spread rapidly, selling tens of thousands of copies in a matter of months. Its impact was enormous. People who had once hesitated began to see independence as common sense rather than radical extremism. By mid-1776, the idea of breaking away from Britain had moved from the edges of debate to the center. As public support grew, colonial leaders knew they needed to act. In June 1776, the Second Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration, explaining why the colonies were separating from Britain. The task fell primarily to Thomas Jefferson, who drew on Enlightenment ideas about natural rights and government. Jefferson wrote that all people are born equal and possess inherent rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments, he argued, exist to protect these rights, and when they fail to do so, the people have the right to change or remove them. The Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4, 1776, served multiple purposes. It announced to the world that the colonies were no longer under British rule. It explained the philosophical reasons for independence, grounding the revolution in universal principles rather than local complaints. And it listed grievances against King George III, accusing him of power, violating rights, and ruling like a tyrant. This was not just a statement of separation, it was a bold claim about what government should be and who it should serve. Signing the declaration was an act of extraordinary courage. The signers understood the consequences. They were publicly committing treason against the British Crown. As one signer famously remarked, they must all hang together, or they would surely hang separately. The declaration transformed the war. It was no longer a conflict over taxes or representation. It was a fight for national independence and human rights. Britain's reaction was swift and hostile. King George III rejected the declaration outright, declaring the colonies to be in open rebellion. British forces intensified their military efforts, determined to crush the uprising. At the same time, independence changed how the world viewed the conflict. Foreign powers, especially France, began to see the colonies not as rebellious subjects, but as a potential new nation. While immediate support did not arrive, the declaration laid the groundwork for future alliances. Across Europe and beyond, the Declaration of Independence attracted attention. Its ideas challenged long-standing beliefs about monarchy and authority. Though not all nations supported the American cause, many recognized the significance of what was happening. A group of colonies had openly rejected imperial rule and claimed the right to govern themselves based on the consent of the people. Declaring independence was one of the most dangerous decisions in American history. It united the colonies under a single purpose, clarified the meaning of the war, and reshaped the struggle into a revolutionary movement. From that moment forward, there was no turning back. The colonies were no longer fighting to be treated fairly within the empire. They were fighting to become a nation of their own. By late 1776, the American Revolution stood at a dangerous crossroads. After the Declaration of Independence, British forces intensified their campaign, determined to crush the rebellion quickly. The Continental Army suffered a series of defeats. Morale was low, and many soldiers' enlistments were about to expire. To many observers, the American cause seemed close to collapse. Yet it was during this period of crisis that the war began to turn, not through a single dramatic victory, but through a series of critical moments that reshaped the conflict. One of the most important early turning points came in December 1776 with the Battle of Trenton. After a string of losses, George Washington understood that his army desperately needed a victory to restore confidence. On the night of December 25th, Washington led his troops across the icy Delaware River in a bold and risky move. Facing freezing temperatures and dangerous conditions, the army surprised a group of Hessian soldiers stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. The attack was swift and successful. Though small in scale, the victory had a powerful psychological impact. It proved that the Continental Army could still fight and win, and it convinced many soldiers to stay in the army rather than return home. Trenton was followed by another success at Princeton, further boosting morale. These victories did not end the war, but they kept the revolution alive at a moment when defeat seemed likely. They showed that leadership, timing, and determination could offset British advantages in training and numbers. Washington's willingness to take calculated risks helped shift the momentum of the war and strengthened his reputation as a capable commander. The most decisive turning point of the entire war came in 1777 at the Battle of Saratoga. British strategy called for cutting off New England, the heart of the rebellion, from the other colonies. British General John Burgoyne led a large force south from Canada, expecting support from other British armies. That support never fully arrived. Instead, Burgoyne's army faced increasing resistance from American forces and local militias. After a series of engagements near Saratoga, New York, Burgoyne found himself surrounded and outnumbered. In October 1777, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army to American General Horatio Gates. This victory was stunning. For the first time, the Americans had defeated a major British force in open battle and forced its surrender. Saratoga was more than a military success. It was a diplomatic breakthrough. It proved that the colonies were capable of defeating Britain, not just surviving against it. The impact of Saratoga extended far beyond the battlefield. Before this victory, European powers were cautious. Supporting the American colonies against Britain was risky, especially if the rebellion failed. Saratoga changed that calculation. France, Britain's longtime rival, now believed the American cause had a real chance of success. In 1778, France formally entered the war as an ally of the United States, providing money, supplies, troops, and naval support. This alliance transformed the revolution into a global conflict and dramatically weakened Britain's position. French support proved essential. French funds helped keep the Continental Army supplied. French officers brought valuable military experience. Most importantly, The French Navy challenged British control of the seas, limiting Britain's ability to move troops and supplies freely. Later in the war, French involvement would play a decisive role in securing final victory. Without French assistance, American independence would have been far more difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. While victories and alliances were crucial, the revolution was also shaped by suffering and endurance. One of the most difficult periods of the war occurred during the winter of 1777–1778 at Valley Forge. The Continental Army camped there, faced freezing temperatures, inadequate shelter, shortages of food, and a lack of proper clothing. Disease spread rapidly, and thousands of soldiers died or deserted. Conditions were so severe that some men left bloody footprints in the snow due to worn-out shoes. Despite these hardships, Valley Forge became a symbol of perseverance rather than defeat. Washington remained with his troops, sharing in their struggles and maintaining discipline. During this time, the army underwent critical training under the guidance of European officers, such as Baron von Steuben. Soldiers learned proper drilling, coordination, and battlefield tactics, transforming the Continental Army into a more professional and effective fighting force. When the army emerged from Valley Forge in the spring, it was stronger, more disciplined, and better prepared for future battles. The experience forged a sense of unity and commitment among the soldiers, reinforcing their belief in the cause they were fighting for. Valley Forge demonstrated that endurance and organization could be as important as battlefield victories. Together, Trenton, Saratoga, French support, and Valley Forge marked a decisive shift in the American Revolution. These turning points showed that the colonies could survive, adapt, and ultimately prevail. What had once seemed like a desperate rebellion began to look like a legitimate struggle for independence. The tide of war was slowly turning, and for the first time, victory no longer seemed impossible. Even after the major turning points of the American Revolution, victory was far from guaranteed. The years following Saratoga were marked by continued fighting, shifting strategies, and ongoing hardship. British forces adjusted their approach, turning their attention to the southern colonies, where they believed Loyalist support would be stronger. This phase of the war brought brutal campaigns, divided communities, and widespread destruction. Both sides suffered losses, and the outcome remained uncertain well into the early 1780s. The Southern Campaign proved difficult for everyone involved. Early British successes, including the capture of key cities, gave the impression that the rebellion could still be crushed. However, American forces adapted by using guerrilla tactics, striking quickly and avoiding direct confrontations when possible. Leaders such as Nathaniel Greene wore down British armies through constant pressure rather than decisive battles. The war became a test of endurance, draining British resources and morale while keeping the American cause alive. Despite French support, American troops continued to face shortages of food, clothing, and pay. Inflation weakened the colonial economy, and civilian support was strained by years of war. Desertion remained a problem, and some soldiers grew weary of endless fighting. Meanwhile, Loyalists faced persecution, forcing many to flee or remain silent. The revolution was not just a war between armies, it was a civil conflict that deeply affected ordinary people. The decisive moment came in 1781 at the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia. British General Charles Cornwallis moved his army to the coastal town of Yorktown, hoping for support and evacuation by the British Navy. Unbeknownst to him, events were unfolding that would seal his fate. George Washington, coordinating with French General Rochambeau, saw an opportunity to trap Cornwallis. In a bold move, Washington shifted his forces south from New York, while the French Navy sailed to block British ships from reaching Yorktown. The plan worked. The French fleet defeated British naval forces in the Battle of the Chesapeake, cutting off Cornwallis's escape by sea. American and French troops surrounded Yorktown on land, beginning a siege that lasted several weeks. Artillery bombarded British positions, steadily weakening their defenses. With no reinforcements and no way out, Cornwallis was forced to surrender his army in October 1781. The surrender at Yorktown was a crushing blow to Britain. Although fighting continued in smaller skirmishes, the loss convinced British leaders that the war was no longer worth the cost. Public support for the war in Britain collapsed, and political pressure mounted to seek peace. Yorktown did not officially end the war, but it effectively ended any realistic chance of British victory. Following Yorktown, negotiations began between American and British representatives. The process was slow and complex, involving multiple nations and competing interests. France and Spain, both allied with the Americans, sought their own gains, while Britain aimed to protect what remained of its empire. Despite these challenges, talks moved forward as all sides recognized the need for resolution. In 1783, the conflict formally concluded with the Treaty of Paris. Under its terms, Great Britain officially recognized the United States as an independent nation. The treaty established national borders, granted Americans access to important fishing grounds, and addressed issues related to property and debts. For the former colonies, this recognition was the ultimate validation of their struggle. After 8 long years of war, independence was no longer an aspiration, it was a reality. The end of the war marked the beginning of a new chapter, but it also left deep scars. Cities had been damaged, families divided, and economies disrupted. Thousands had lost their lives, and many more had sacrificed years of hardship. Yet the victory carried profound meaning. A group of colonies had successfully challenged a global empire and secured the right to govern themselves. The American Revolution ended not with a single battle, but with persistence, cooperation, and strategic patience. From continued fighting and painful setbacks to the triumph at Yorktown and the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the path to victory was long and uncertain. In the end, the colonies achieved what once seemed impossible: independence and the chance to shape their own future as a new nation. With the war won and independence secured, the former colonies faced a challenge unlike any they had encountered before: building a nation from scratch. Victory over Britain did not automatically create a stable country. The 13 colonies, now calling themselves states, had different economies, traditions, and priorities. They were united by their struggle for independence, but unsure how closely they wanted to be tied together moving forward. The task ahead was not just to govern, but to define what the United States would become. The transition from colonies to states marked a profound change. No longer under the authority of a king, each state claimed sovereignty over its own affairs. State governments were established or rewritten, often emphasizing limits on executive power and greater influence for elected legislatures. Many Americans feared replacing one form of tyranny with another, so early state constitutions reflected a deep suspicion of strong central authority. This cautious approach protected local control, but made national cooperation difficult. Unity quickly became the central problem. During the war, cooperation had been necessary for survival, but in peacetime, old rivalries resurfaced. States argued over borders, trade, taxes, and war debts. Some states were wealthy and commercial, while others were largely agricultural. Differences in population size and economic strength made it difficult to agree on fair representation. Without a clear national framework, disputes threatened to tear the new nation apart before it could truly begin. To address these concerns, leaders turned to the Articles of Confederation, America's first national government. Drafted during the war and officially adopted in 1781, the Articles reflected the colonies' fear of centralized power. Under this system, the national government was intentionally weak. Congress could declare war, negotiate treaties, and manage foreign relations, but it had no power to tax citizens directly or regulate trade between states. Each state retained its independence, and major decisions required approval from most or all states. At first, the Articles seemed to reflect the revolutionary spirit. They preserved liberty by limiting federal authority and emphasized cooperation rather than control. However, weaknesses soon became obvious. Without the power to tax, the national government struggled to pay war debts or support a standing army. States printed their own money, leading to inflation and economic instability. Trade disputes arose as states imposed tariffs on one another, undermining national unity. Foreign policy also suffered. European powers doubted the strength of the new government, and Britain was slow to fully respect American independence. Without a strong central authority, the United States found it difficult to enforce treaties or defend its borders. Internally, unrest grew as farmers and laborers faced economic hardship. Events like Shays' Rebellion highlighted the government's inability to maintain order, alarming many leaders. Despite its flaws, the Articles of Confederation were an important step. They represented the first attempt to unite the states under a single national system and demonstrated the challenges of balancing freedom with effective governance. Most importantly, they sparked critical debates about the role of government debates that would shape the future of the United States. Underlying these debates were the revolutionary ideas that had fueled independence in the first place. Concepts such as natural rights, consent of the governed, and equality before the law continued to guide political thinking. Americans believed that power should come from the people, not from inherited authority. This belief encouraged widespread participation in political life and reinforced the idea that government existed to serve its citizens. These principles eventually led to the realization that a stronger national framework was necessary, one that could unite the states while still protecting individual liberties. The experience under the Articles set the stage for future reform, showing both what Americans feared and what they needed. Revolutionary ideals did not fade after independence. Instead, they evolved, influencing debates about representation, checks and balances, and the limits of power. Creating a new nation was a process filled with uncertainty, disagreement, and experimentation. The United States was not instantly stable or unified, but it was grounded in powerful ideas born from revolution. By turning colonies into states, confronting the challenges of unity, and learning from early governing failures, Americans laid the foundation for a future government that would strive to balance liberty with strength. The revolution had ended, but the work of nation-building had only just begun. When we look back at the American Revolution, it is easy to see the outcome as inevitable. The United States exists today, and history often feels like a straight line leading to that result. But in reality, American victory was anything but certain. 13 small, divided colonies stood against the most powerful empire in the world. They lacked money, training, unity, and experience. At multiple points during the war, defeat seemed far more likely than success. Armies froze, starved, deserted, and lost battles. Cities fell, supplies vanished, foreign support was uncertain. The revolution survived, not because it was easy, but because people refused to give up when failure appeared inevitable. Independence was not handed to the colonies, it was earned through years of sacrifice. Soldiers endured brutal winters, marched without shoes, and fought battles they were not guaranteed to win. Families lost sons, fathers, and brothers. Civilians suffered shortages, inflation, and violence as the war reached towns and farms. Loyalists were forced to choose between safety and belief, while patriots risked everything for an uncertain future. Even the leaders of the revolution lived with the constant threat of capture and execution. The freedom gained in 1783 came at a tremendous human cost, paid not just by famous figures, but by ordinary people whose names history rarely records. The American Revolution was also more than a military struggle. It was a turning point in world history. By challenging monarchy and declaring that government exists to serve the people, the revolution introduced ideas that would echo far beyond North America. The Declaration of Independence inspired reformers, revolutionaries, and thinkers across the globe. In France, it influenced calls for liberty and equality. In Latin America, it encouraged independence movements against European empires. Even centuries later, its language continues to shape discussions about rights, democracy, and what made the American Revolution truly revolutionary was its message, that power does not come from birthright or conquest, but from the consent of the governed. This idea challenged centuries of tradition and authority. It suggested that ordinary people had not only the right, but the responsibility, to shape their own government. While the new nation would struggle to live up to these ideals fully, the principles themselves became a powerful standard against which future generations would measure progress. As we reflect on this history, one question remains as important today as it was in 1776. What does freedom truly require? Is it simply independence from foreign rule? Constant effort, participation, and sacrifice? The American Revolution shows that freedom is not a single moment or document. It is an ongoing process. It requires courage in times of uncertainty, unity in moments of division, and a willingness to defend principles even when the cost is high. The birth of the United States was not perfect, nor was it complete. It was the beginning of an experiment, one built on ideals that would be tested, challenged, and redefined over time. Yet the revolution proved that determined people could stand against overwhelming power and reshape their future. From scattered colonies emerged a nation founded on the belief that liberty belongs to the people. That legacy continues today. The American Revolution reminds us that history is shaped by choices, persistence, and belief in something greater than fear. It stands as a powerful example of how ideas, when paired with sacrifice, can change the world. If you found this story meaningful, share your thoughts in the comments. What part of the American Revolution do you think mattered most? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more in-depth history stories that explore how the past continues to shape our world.